Presidential candidates have chairmen who run their campaigns in various counties across the U.S. Campaigns in the U.S. are huge, require a lot of on the ground work, so parties organize themselves with campaign managers and chairpersons. It's very much a delegate, delegate, delegate situation. Timothy Lee Nolan claims he was a presidential campaign chair in Campbell County, Kentucky. He claimed he chaired Trump's bid for president in 2016 in that county. He was a former leader in the Republican Party, but he was not the chair of Trump's campaign in Kentucky. His claims to be more than that were a lie. He was a Kentucky State District Court judge from 1978 to 1986. He made a bid for the Kentucky Supreme Court in 1982, but lost at the primary stage. For a few days, he was a member of the First Kentucky Boxing and Wrestling Commission. He was removed from that office over a racist social media post very quickly. Along with the racial social media post, his lawyer would also admit that he dressed up as a KKK in a KKK costume every year. He was licensed to practice law in Ohio, but he was disbarred there in 2022. He is also a convicted child sex trafficker and human trafficker who sat on the Campbell County School Board when he was arrested. The story of this man's dirty deeds shook Kentucky, but brought justice to at least 19 victims, many of them children. In 2017, Nolan was charged with 28 felonies, including rape, human trafficking, witness tampering, prostitution, unlawful transaction with a minor, and sodomy. The charges included 22 victims, and 8 of those were juveniles. Another man connected to the case, former attorney Robert Poole, was sentenced in 2022 on 2 counts of promoting human trafficking. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison to be served along with another sentence in a different county. And he was also supposed to pay $10,000 to the Human Trafficking Victims Fund. He was also sentenced on 5 counts of promoting human trafficking in the other county to 8 years in prison, probation for 5 years, and $40,000 to the Victims Fund. There is a 10-year protective order on his 13 victims. And that took care of his conspirator in the whole mess. Nolan himself would plead not guilty in May 2017. For a little while, the case would work its way toward trial. At age 71 in February 2018, he would plead guilty to 21 counts on the indictment. And then he would try to back out of the plea agreement in March and set the matter back on the road to trial. The judge, however, was having none of that. He had been disruptive of the court proceedings. Along with trying to withdraw his plea, he fired his lawyers just before he was sentenced in March, trying to ensure the delay of the case, anything to delay justice. He even accused the judge and her family of having a personal vendetta against him. None of the courtroom shenanigans really worked out well for him, and so, sitting shackled in a courtroom, he was sentenced in May 2018. The threats, manipulation, and ultimate abuse end today, the judge would tell him. The counts that he pleaded guilty to went back to 2004, included 19 victims, including 7 who were just kids. All were vulnerable. All but 2 were addicted to opioids. Opioid addiction is rampant in many states, due in large part to unethical practices of overprescribing, referred to as the opioid crisis. And we'll get back to the opioid crisis in a later case. Back to pedophile and sex offender Nolan. He would meet many of his victims at places he knew he could find vulnerable women and girls. For many predators, that includes the streets, drug houses, shady bars. For a judge, it includes local women's shelters in Covington, Kentucky. In particular, the Transitions Women's Residential Addiction Program and drug court. Drug courts are meant to help vulnerable people who are addicted to drugs get help and support, and yet there among those trying to make some difference was a predator. Investigators, in fact, would find many Nolan victims in jail. Addicted and vulnerable, they would often run afoul of the law. He often used his past as a judge and a lawyer, not only to find his victims, but to intimidate them as well. He would tell the women and girls that he knew judges and other powerful people who could put them in jail or take their children from them. He would threaten them with their children. He told one victim that he would call his friends in the FBI to have her arrested, and they all felt powerless to his threats. He plied some of the child victims with drugs or alcohol in exchange for sex. He threatened tenants with eviction if they denied him sex. He asked a young victim to give him a back rub and asked her for sex in exchange for money. He offered heroin and painkillers in exchange for sex. Anything he could do to force or extort or ply compliance from his victims, he did. He would tell them that tagline that most predators use, that no one would ever believe them if they said what he did to them. Many of the girls and women believed that. They believed that deeply. Nolan was a powerful man. He did have a lot of friends. He did know people. And he knew people who knew people. But for all of his power, his friends, and his threats, it would be a 13-year-old girl who took him down. Let's call her Angel. In December 2016, Angel went to her high school counselor and alleged sexual abuse against the landlord. Angel's family rented from Nolan in a property next to the Rabbit Hole, which was a dive bar that Nolan also owned. Both Angel and her mother were targeted. She did not want to come forward at first. Her family was trying to get Nolan to agree to sell them a house on a rent-to-own basis. I didn't want to give that up. We finally had enough room for my family. But she spoke up anyway, despite the fear, the pressure, the agonizing knowledge that she would lose the chance of a house for her family. She just couldn't hold it in any longer. Because she did, 18 other victims would come forward to tell their stories. Because she stood up, Nolan would finally face justice. The plea agreement with prosecutors required 20 years in prison and a $100,000 fine, another $10,000 to the Human Trafficking Victims Fund. Nolan will spend 5 years on probation with the condition that he have approval before being around any child. He will have to register as a sex offender for life. He can't engage in social media. He can't watch any form of pornography. He is eligible for parole, or he was eligible for parole for the first time in 2022. On some of the charges, rather than admit the facts, he entered an Alford plea. In the U.S., an Alford plea happens when an offender admits that the prosecutor has enough evidence to convict. Despite the fact that his plea agreement required 20 years imprisonment followed by probation, this man, this predator, thought probation would be good. He asked the court for probation for all of that, for all his crimes, telling the judge that he could still contribute to society. He said he was a first-time offender, but really it was just his first time being caught. He claimed he was at low risk to reoffend with 19 victims going back a decade. He promised to get treatment. He put all his deliberate manipulation, his rapes, his sexual abuse, his feeding drugs to minors in exchange for sex, all of that, he said, was just a lack of sound judgment. At one point, it was reported that his lawyers made a vague reference to how sex is viewed by different generations, believe it or not. He took full personal responsibility for these acts that in his potential day and generation would not necessarily be considered to rise to the level of human trafficking. To be clear, it was illegal when Nolan was a lawyer. It was illegal when he was a judge. It's been illegal for as long as Nolan has been alive to rape children, to engage in prostitution, to force others to engage in prostitution. That's what they would have called it in his potential day and generation. It was wrong for Nolan's entire lifetime, and he knew it, hence the threats. The difference is that in his youth, powerful men were rarely, if ever, investigated, prosecuted, and convicted. That was a problem of a lack of law enforcement against powerful men, not a problem of what was or was not illegal. Many a poor man who lacked the benefit of privilege died in prison in his youth for the same crimes that he committed. This is not a case about changing times. This case is not one of differing perceptions of right and wrong between generations. That argument is tired, and it's also a bold lie. Nolan was deliberately manipulating the situation to force women and girls into sex with him. Period. Full stop. She also made a vague reference to criminal defendants facing the insurmountable obstacle of proving their complete innocence. The lie detector would determine that was a lie, as Maury Povich would say. She is a lawyer. He was a lawyer. They both know that criminal defendants have no such obstacle to overcome. They are presumed to be innocent, and the prosecutors have to prove each and every element of each and every charge beyond a reasonable doubt. The Alford police acknowledged that there was overwhelming evidence to convict him. That was the obstacle, the evidence, not some fairy tale that twists how the presumption of innocence works. Nolan has not quietly faded into a jail cell. He filed 2 lawsuits against family members and an auction house from prison, saying that they're selling off his assets through a trust without his permission. He says 2 real estate auctions and 3 online auctions of his personal property have already liquidated some of his assets. He claims that he was incompetent when he created the trust and made his daughter's trustee. He says he had a brain tumor, mental issues, and hallucinations. He accused one daughter, a court clerk, of inside information. His lawyer says his daughters left him on the scrap heap. Imagine Nolan accusing others of manipulation and stealing from him. The irony is so rich, and the sympathy is near zero. He also filed an appeal against his sentence, the one he signed a plea agreement over, the one that spared him from potentially decades more in prison. I can't tell you any details about that appeal because there's a publication ban on the matter, and I'm going to respect the order of that court, even though it doesn't apply in my jurisdiction. Really interested people can find the appeal online if they look well enough, but what can be said is he failed. A second appeal can be talked about. He alleged that the Supreme Court of Kentucky was wrong in denying him relief by throwing out the charges because of an error in the way that the charges were written that was corrected. He also questioned the constitutionality of the human trafficking statute and claimed the judge interfered with his right to counsel after he fired his lawyers and wanted to represent himself. Can you imagine this man who manipulated and was so awful to the victims, getting to question the victims? No. He complained in that case that he didn't realize he would have to take sex offender treatment in prison before the parole board would consider his release. Still not getting it. In the end, the words he spoke in his sentencing, the words of his lawyer, those ridiculous submissions, those are going to be forgotten. The words of his victims tell the true scope, the heartbreak of this story, and those are the words that will stand. Tim Nolan, I want to say you ruined my life. You ruined my childhood, teenage years, and made me lose hope. I hate you. From a teenage victim. I find it hard to sleep some nights because certain images from my past encounters with Tim Nolan continue to haunt me. From a victim. Because of my time with him, I don't know that I will ever be the same. I have no self-confidence or worth. I hate myself and feel dirty for all the things I had to do with him. A victim. I was forced to stay in his apartment in Alexandria and was told if I ever left he would call police and I would go back to jail because I was on the run. I ended up turning myself in because jail was better than one more second spent with Tim Nolan, an adult victim. Tim Nolan knew vulnerability when he saw it. He used my addiction as a tactic for control, an adult victim. And each time I left him, he took a piece of my soul as payment. Another victim. Thank you for listening.
In court, just kind of an overview And it's like how I talk, so the students seem to really enjoy it.
Terrific. And if people want to follow you, are you on social media or can they find you through the university?
They can definitely find me.
If you're enjoying these videos and you want to see more, please click the subscribe button and hit those notifications so that you don't miss any uploads. We appreciate you. Thanks.